I did need to give you a little bit of background again on what was going on around the time of William of Pagula when he was writing. Because the King of England at this time had a lot to do with that, you know, what William was writing about. This is a mirror to the king, and so the king definitely on his mind. Now, a lot of what is described up here actually happened after William wrote this mirror. The war with France was just getting started. So a lot of what you're reading from your selection has to do with other practices of the king, but with the same motivation. The king was very warlike, and he needed a lot of money to carry on his exploits, and in general he thought that his people were a good source for that money. So King Edward's dates are up there, and as you can see, that means that he became King of England at the age of 15. And maybe that had something to do with his temperament, because he never really did get the tutelage. You know, he had the power at 15, and so didn't have a lot of years of being able to watch and practice leadership. He, as I said, was a very warlike king. He felt like his main job was to do that, and he had been trying to suppress the Scottish, which is an ongoing issue in English history. And France, of course, allied with the Scottish. And so along with his hostilities toward the Scots, he decided that he would invade France. And Edward's way of thinking runs something like this: it's always good to invade another country. You know, it's what he did. That's what he considered to be his primary occupation. So, you know, things have changed quite a bit, and yet have they in different parts of the world. But typically we see this as a medieval mindset or frame of mind in which war is undertaken because it looks like it's a good thing to do, right? Rather than for just defensive purposes or, you know, because you feel threatened or anything like that. Edward saw France as a good place to invade, and he saw it as his right to do so. And so he was quite successful at first, actually able to take over control of about half of France, and he named himself King of France. And this was a title that future English kings continued to bear, even though they didn't always have control of French territory, or only a small part of it. But that starts from that time period. So he assumed that title in 1340. But in the process of obtaining this great honor, he basically bankrupted his country. He bankrupted himself as well, and he needed even more money. So some of his excessive taxation and the actions of his nobles towards the peasantry comes from this just insatiable desire for money in order to fuel his plans. Okay? Unfortunately for him, though he spent a lot of money and a lot of people died in the pursuit of his goals, most of the land that he had been able to obtain, he lost within a short period of time, and continued to battle the French, and that went on for a long, long time. The English and the French do not like each other for very good reasons. So, not only did he spend money on his wars, but he also lived very well, and he kind of considered it his right to spend as much as he needed, and he would get that money any way he could, by taxing, by borrowing. You know, kings went into debt. He went into debt. So this was the not so pretty side of King Edward. Now, how do the English remember Edward? They tend to remember him for this, okay? So, and they sort of put aside the fact that he was a rather greedy, rapacious king who caused a lot of trouble for the English. but they do remember him for this, that he was sort of the father of English chivalry. He established the Order of the Garter, which order still exists to this day. And it's a very tight, small organization made up of the royals and a very select group of 24 nobles, typically. And so chivalry was highly emphasized, but it was mainly warlike chivalry. In other words, the rewards that come from prowess in battle, contributions to the king's war efforts were highly valued and very highly rewarded. And so people who did that ended up in the Order of the Garter, of course, with all the honors and privileges and recognition. This was a period of time in which, when the nobles weren't engaged in battle, they were engaging in tournaments and competitions to hone their skills, so this was emphasized as well. Okay. And so I looked up the Order of the Garter and to see what was going on now, and there's the British Monarchy website. Let me pull it up here. As you can see, it's still in existence, and it serves somewhat the same purpose, which is to honor the people who are highly valued by the monarchy. It says the Order of the Garter is the most senior and oldest British order of chivalry, founded by Edward III in 1348. The order, consisting of the king and 25 knights, honors those who have held public office, who have contributed in a particular way to the national life, or have served the sovereign personally. The patron saint of the order is St. George, who just happens to be my patron saint. And the spiritual home of the order is St. George's Chapel in Windsor. So there's all sorts of regalia and signs of honor that go along with this to this day. There's an insignia. It says, starting with a garter and badge depicting St. George and the dragon. And it goes on. Eventually they, other than the Queen, who was always a member, allowed women to be in this order. See, it says, during the Middle Ages, ladies were associated with the order, although unlike today, they did not enjoy full membership. One of the last medieval ladies to be honored was Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII. So, and then later on, Edward VII made Queen Alexandra Lady of the Order. And in 1987, the Queen decided that women should be eligible for the Garter in the same way as men. So, and they have a list of them. I like this. This motto is great. Shame on him who thinks this evil. What does that mean? But here's the list. Let's see if I can get this up. It's a PDF. Okay, so from what I can tell to this day, it's all pretty much aristocrats. These are the dates at which they were inducted, I would assume. So a lot of the royals of Europe are now there. I'm not seeing too many commoners here. Kind of gives you an idea of the way the English think and the way that Americans think really is very different, even to this day. I mean, they have de-emphasized the aristocracy to a certain degree, but they still have it, very much they still have it. Some of these families have been around a long, long time. And so they still have this upper class of people who are in that class because of their heritage. Here's a name that I recognize because that family was sponsored Thomas Hobbes a long, long time ago. So anyway, the Order of the Garter is still in existence, and so if the English think about King Edward, I'm sure this is what pops into their head, is that the order and the whole idea of English chivalry, right? and not so much the other side of Edward, which involved the constant warfare and high taxes and all of his policies. But at the time, people probably thought of him differently, and that comes out in this mirror. Okay, most people would have been, of course, afraid to say anything. However, William is apparently not afraid to say something. He made people more poor in this country, and the conflict that he started with France was on and off for the next 100 years. And so, as it says, until 1801, there was this claim that the English made to the French throne. And of course, that rivalry led to, constant battles with the French. All right. In addition to the trouble that he made himself, he also had to deal with the plague, which rampaged through England, but did not slow him down as far as his attempts at France or his spending. Okay? Again, this happened after William writes this mirror. So William is writing this mirror at the beginning of the wars with France. Okay? But he already senses, and I've seen this with other political thinkers, it doesn't take much for some people to recognize a serious problem. For instance, Edmund Burke wrote the Reflections on the Revolution in France at the very beginning of the French Revolution, before the terror, before so many of the extreme excesses of the French Revolution. But he could foresee them, and the way that he wrote about the revolution, he described a mentality that came into being, that became very manifest later on in the revolution. And I think William is that kind of thinker. He sees in the king's basic character and the way that he operates significant, deep flaws, and he can see where these flaws will lead. Okay? So even though he hasn't seen all of the things that will happen to his people, okay, he kind of foresees the trouble that the king's character will cause. And so this book is addressing that character. Okay? It's a mirror book, and it's addressing the king's deep character flaws as he sees them. All right, so William of Pagula, there are his dates. He was a priest, and not a high-level person at all, but just an ordinary parish priest. Okay? He had a doctorate in canon law, and as you can see when you read his work, he did not have maybe appropriate fear. Okay? Because if somebody criticized the king at this time, they risked definitely. You didn't need a trial. The Tower of London has also been around for a long time, so the king could have thrown William in the Tower and kept him there indefinitely, or put him on trial if he wanted to, or not, whatever, or just have him executed. So William took quite a risk in writing this. And it's written, as I said, in the style of a mirror. And again, most of you probably have some familiarity with that term. We introduced it in the intro to political thought class, but if not, basically it's the idea of a short advice book written to princes, kings, nobles, to allow them to reflect on their basic character. Okay? Everybody was a Catholic at this point, and they all had to go to confession. Okay? And before you go to confession, is anybody here a Catholic? What do you do? Okay, what do you do before you go to confession?
Reflect, I guess, on what your sins are so you can give them to the priest, I guess.
Yeah, you have to think about it ahead of time. And there's actually, even to this day, there's lots of tools that you can use if you want to, called examination of conscience. Okay? So you can get a pamphlet, for instance, from your priest that has a list of questions, you know, have you done this, have you done that, have you thought about this, have you thought about that, which you can use to think about your sins and kind of compile a list, more or less, so that when you go to the priest you have something to say. The purpose of this, of course, is exactly that, so that you have something to say, but also because it does, it sort of reminds you that yes, you're flawed. In other words, human beings have a tendency to forget about their flaws. And when you read one of these, you realize, oh my God, you know, yes, I have done some bad things, and I'm not totally perfect. So that's what the medieval mirror functioned as, sort of as for the upper class and the king at this time. Okay? Sort of an examination of conscience designed for him to look at himself, to examine himself, and to make this kind of assessment of his own character, maybe to use to confess, but also just generally to use to guide this king to right his character flaws. Okay? Now, the way that we introduced it in the Intro to Political Thought class was through Machiavelli, who wrote a sort of anti-mirror book. So we didn't look at a mirror book directly there. We looked at Machiavelli's Prince. And remember what Machiavelli's Prince was about? It wasn't about Christian virtue, right? It was about virtù. You know, Machiavelli's focus was on political capabilities. And he put morality aside, okay? And he said, you know, a prince who's guided by moral virtue or by Christian virtue is probably not going to be able to succeed because other people will not play by those rules, okay? So his book is a sort of commentary against books like William of Pagula's, okay? So now we're getting to see the other side of this picture, because William follows in a long tradition of people who wrote this kind of book. Maybe not this vociferous, okay? Because William gets pretty, he doesn't mince words, does he? No. I think a lot of mirror books, Christine is an example of this that we'll be looking at next week, are a little bit less biting than this. And what makes this special is that he's kind of like the other guy that we looked at from Padua. Okay? He's really capable of being very seriously critical. Okay? So the mirror discusses what Christian virtue is. It spends a lot of time on the duties that the king and the nobility have towards each other, towards God, and towards the people. Okay? And I want to emphasize duties here because the medieval point of view didn't have much to do with rights directly. You won't see them making any commentary about rights. However, I hope you can also see as we go through this that the medieval way of thinking did help create the foundation. Books like this help create the foundation for the modern view of social contract, individual rights, right? Political responsibilities. So it also discusses the bond of love between the people and their superiors. You may remember from the intro class, if you took it, that Marx mentions this in the Communist Manifesto. He says it was an illusion, right? But a pleasant illusion that the people from the Middle Ages had, that they had these natural superiors. And the natural superiors did rule over them, but they had these responsibilities to care for their natural inferiors, kind of like parents care for their children, okay? And Marx, of course, said, well, this was a pleasant illusion that kept people in their place, okay? But somebody like William of Pagula really believes that there is such a thing as a natural superior and natural inferiors, and he does preach this bond of love based upon Christian charity, okay? That you have a responsibility if you're born into the upper class to take care of those and to not abuse those beneath you, okay? All right, so how does William deviate from previous mirrors? Well, primarily in that he's bolder in his criticisms. This stands out because of the rather open, intense, and specific criticism that he levels at the king. Okay? And also because he adds this element in more strongly. Okay? Now, many mirror writers had said, you know, the people form they're the feet and the hands, you know, that whole body politic image, and therefore they're very important, and you have to, you know, pay attention to them. But both of our authors this week also hint at this idea that ultimately the power of their superiors comes from the consent of the people. In other words, these inferiors, that they are citizens, they have to see this government as legitimate. And the power of the king comes from their willing consent. Okay? And that makes him a little different too. Machiavelli later on tries to push the same idea without the Christian angle, you know, that the power of the prince should come from the people's willing consent, because only then can you have a strong kingdom. You have to have people's cooperation. You can't just force it on them, or what you will get is a lack of cooperation, a slowdown of operations, less money, okay? So he's in agreement with Machiavelli on that point. And all of this, I hope, will show you that, you know, because you're often taught that the idea of rights and social contract comes in around the Enlightenment time, like somehow, boom, here it is, we have a new idea, okay? Or actually from Hobbes, who's sort of pre-Enlightenment thinker, you know, comes up with social contract, individual rights, and, you know, Locke and Rousseau and other thinkers, Montaigne and Montesquieu, and et cetera, they all kind of derive from this modern thought. But actually, there is no immediate break. There's no boom, here it is, new idea, okay? It developed over a long, long period of time, and some of these medieval thinkers contributed to it and formed the basis of it. So that's what I've been trying to get across on Monday as well. There is no break, really, you know, and this is the heritage that leads to modern liberal thought. Okay, it's more like a spectrum, okay, rather than some sort of break. All right, does anybody remember from your reading of this piece what authority he quotes most of the time? What's the most predominant authority for him? This is very characteristic, again, of medieval thought, is that they always fell back on an authority of some sort. Okay? And as we've seen, Aristotle, for some of them,
about divine authority.
Yeah, for him it's the Bible. That's the predominant one. Okay, so in fact he doesn't quote Aristotle directly at all. That may be because he didn't have access to Aristotle's writings. Because he does say the human reason is reliable and that we should use it, and that we don't have to stick only to revelation. The two can be combined. But he doesn't quote directly from Aristotle. He does quote Augustine in the Romans, which leads me to think that is what he had access to, and that he knew Latin so he could read it. Okay? So we see some use of these authorities, but the main authority is the Bible. And one of the reasons why people later on criticize, like Hobbes criticizes medieval thinkers, is because of this reliance on authority. Okay? Hobbes said, well, we should rely upon our observations and we should rely upon our reason. But what is this idea that it's proof just because we quote the Bible? Now, Hobbes quoted the Bible a lot himself, okay, because I think he considered that to be good backup, okay, as long as it agreed with what he had to say. But he disliked what he called the scholastic method of the Middle Ages, because it was as though they were saying, you know, because Aristotle said this, or because the Bible says this, it means it's true. And Hobbes disagreed that that was a good enough reason. But that, you know, that was based upon the reason that once you accept the Bible as true, okay, which is based upon faith, then you ought to be able to use it as an authority, okay? So this is the way that they thought, all right? So yes, he relies mainly on the Bible, so he's connecting up. The power of this argument is he connects up the Christian religion very much with his criticism of the king. And he's saying that if you accept Christianity, if you believe these things, then you have to admit the king's behavior doesn't measure up to these standards. Okay? All right, so William's advice. Well, this is the big theme for him, is the king's duty to care for his people, to take care of them, based upon his love, his Christian love. Remember, we talked about how Christian love is different than personal love, in the sense that, you know, these thinkers say the king should love his people. Well, he doesn't even know most of them, okay? But it's an attitude of charity. Okay? Love for every human being, because why? Why should the king love every human being? Despite the fact that most of them aren't nobles and he doesn't know them.
The Bible says?
Yeah, it's what the Bible says. The Bible says that, more or less, that human beings are all created by God, right? So if they're all created by God, they're all God's children, so to speak, right? So in that sense, they're equal, and they all have that spark of dignity in them based upon being created by God, the same as you, the noble, okay? So that means you have to respect them, means you have to love them, because they are part of God's creation. So it's as simple as that. Now here's a quote that may have been a little bit mysterious to you, but it really, this is what this whole selection is about. He says, "Justice is to return to each what is his own. For justice never sells another's goods, but gives to each what is his own. It neglects its own utility so that it might serve the communal equity." Which is basically saying love should be selfless. It should be not about what's useful for me, but about whatever is good for the community as a whole. Okay? What does he mean, justice never sells another's goods? What do you think?
Maybe taking credit for something somebody else did.
Okay, yeah, that definitely would fall into that category, wouldn't it? It's basically taking someone else's property in a way when you take credit, yeah?
Is he, I don't know, is he calling out the king maybe for just taking everyone's thing, like absurd taxes or something?
Mm-hmm. That's a part of it, yep. Taking people's property in the form of taxes, he was certainly critical of, because the king excessively taxed people to the point where it was difficult for them to make a living. Okay? So that also was a part of it. Okay? There was a specific practice which he gets into as well, but not that comment covers all of what you've said. Okay? It's any sort of taking of people's property without their consent. Okay? Abusive taking. And the specific practice that he criticizes is called purveyance, the right of purveyance, so to speak, okay? Or the privilege, I suppose. And this was the noble's privilege or right to be able to take anything they wanted to from people just because they needed it and set the price themselves. They did have to pay people something, but the people whose property they were taking did not get to set the price. They got to set the price. So, you know, it'd be like if I was a member of the noble class and you had an iPad and I needed an iPad, I walk over to you and say, I forgot my iPad and I have a business meeting to go to. I need this, and I'll give you $150 for it. and you think it's worth $500, because that's what you paid for it 2 days ago. You don't get to bargain with me. Okay? You don't get to say no, first of all. Okay? And also, you don't get to deal with me. You just have to take my price. Okay? And if you don't, I'm going to call the police, and you're going to go to jail. That's what purveyance was like. Although it wasn't an iPad, which one might argue maybe is a little bit of a superfluous item, it was usually something people really needed, as in this example. You know, if the nobleman's horse had gone lame, he needed another horse. First peasant who had a horse that he came to, he would simply say, I need your horse, I'll pay you this for it. And they had to take it. Okay? And it was way less than what this was worth to them. And maybe this is this peasant's only horse. This is what he uses to get his goods to market. This is what he uses to plow his land. Okay? And so he can't go take this money and buy another animal because it's not enough. So now he's out of, he can't do his business. He can't make his own money. Okay? And this story happened over and over and over again. Or the nobles would come and they'd say, we need a place to sleep tonight and some food. And they basically just make your home a hotel. And you had to put them up. You had to provide them with whatever they wanted. And they could give you whatever they wanted in return. You could not refuse. Okay? You know, the way that they saw it was, well, what would be their justification? What would be the nobles' justification for operating like this, do you think?
We're doing them a favor by paying them at all.
Yeah, that's part of it. You know, we're being kind. We don't have to pay them, but we're giving them what we consider to be a fair price. So, you know, at least we're not totally ignoring their needs. Yes?
They want to say, well, we're protecting them in different ways, I guess, like with the military, stuff like that, so they should give us some kind of compensation.
Absolutely. Yeah, we are their protectors, and we're their benefactors. And they, you know, they owe us the support that we need. Absolutely. Yeah. You know, it's just such a different way of thinking that it's hard for us to kind of wrap our minds around this. Okay, but from the nobles' point of view, they weren't doing anything wrong. Okay, for a lot of them, this was just to be expected, and they deserved it. And I don't think for a lot of these people, they had enough connection with the lives of ordinary people to be able to even see the impact of this directly. But even if they had, they might have said, well, it's justified because, you know, we have to do what we have to do in order to preserve this kingdom, okay? And if some people have to suffer as a result, at least we're providing for the well-being of the whole, okay? So they would justify it in that way. Unfortunately, in an emergency, perhaps this could be justified, okay, in an extreme emergency. Okay? But what was going on in Edward's kingdom was people were just doing, you know, they were just abusing this power all over the place. And so, you know, whenever the nobles rolled into town, so to speak, people were running for cover. They were trying to get away before they were the next in line, you know, to have their pockets picked or their things taken. So this is specifically what he's complaining about, but it symbolizes the larger picture that you guys were talking about, that basically the upper class thought that they could take whatever they wanted, and they didn't think about the well-being of the people enough. They used justifications about their duties and so forth, but they really didn't think about the well-being of the people enough. And they didn't connect the people's well-being up with their own, not the way they should, okay? Or at least that's what he thinks. So William comes up with this hierarchy of justice. Our duty to do justice first to God, of course, and then to the country, which is the community, the whole people, to our family, not our parents, but to our family, and to all human beings, okay, regardless of country. So that's a hierarchy. You know, this is most important, and then your own country, then your family, okay? Which is a deviation from the ancient view, which might have said God's first, family second, definitely, okay? Then country. And I don't think they would have had everybody on their radar screen at all. That this is a Christian edition, because ultimately, from the Christian perspective, all human beings are the same, children of God, even if they're Frenchmen. Ah! What a horrible thought for the English. So, the king's actions, he says, very simply, are not what God wants, and he thinks he can prove that, because they don't match up with charity towards your fellow man. They're harmful to the king's country, and he tries to prove that as well. And his argument is about, you know, if you impoverish people, let's think about this. If you impoverish people, then ultimately, how wealthy can you be? If you take away their ability to do business, to make money, you may get those funds once, but then never again. Okay? So by ignoring the impact of their actions on the people and their prosperity, ultimately they're ignoring their own well-being. So he points out that these practices are done for selfish reasons, but in narrow self-interest, and fueled by the desire for power, which is sinful. Okay? Again, different from the ancient view, typically was that the desire for power was totally understandable. But this is the injection of the Christian perspective. Okay? You know, this is from the devil, basically. I mean, he basically says that later on in the piece. The desire for power is from the devil. It causes people to enjoy lording over and abusing other people. Okay? So he criticizes this action very strongly, saying it's against God's will. All right, so he's totally remember what Augustine said about the king, or any person in power? He said he's in power because God put him there, and if he's a bad ruler, it's because people deserve punishment. Okay? How different this perspective is. Okay? Now we have William judging the king against God's will. Okay? Using independently his notions about what Christianity demands, and finding the king is not measuring up. And he's victimizing people. This isn't a punishment for people's sins. Rather, the king is getting away with sinning. And so, among other things, he warns there's a judgment day for the king. He's violating, he's sinning, and eventually God will right these wrongs. Okay? Then he talks about what should the king do as opposed to what he's doing. And the first duties of the king are very practical. And again, the ideas like this flow into later thought about what sovereignty is, what the social contract should be about, and so forth. The first and foremost duties of a king should be law and order in his own country and external security. If you don't have those two things, what else can you accomplish? They're very, very basic. If you don't have law and order in your own society, people, again, can't do business. They can't. They can't make contracts. They can't have relationships. Right? They can't also trust their king. They don't admire him. They blame him. Okay? Very much the same way of thinking as Machiavelli later on. Same thing with external security. If he can't supply it, or if, like Edward, he constantly is getting his people into wars, which may not be necessary, then he's actually doing the opposite of what he should do. He's putting them at risk. Okay? So, though he doesn't have a just war doctrine, he does reflect the general view of the just war doctrine that developed in the Middle Ages that really the king needs to think about national security, but not wars of conquest. The wars of conquest are not just, okay? Then after internal and external security, he then lists several other duties, Christian charitable duties, such as caring for the poor and caring for the sick. So how would a good king carry those out, do you think? Back in those days. This is the 14th century.
At least one thing is the king could stop taxing the poor so heavily, or eliminate what is it called?
Purveyance.
Purveyance.
So he can get rid of those abusive practices of overtaxation and taking people's things from them. So he can get out of the way. Anything else he could do of a positive nature? He can encourage charity in people, in members of the noble class who have funds that could be used instead of war making to provide charitable services for people. He could support the church, could provide charitable services for people like orphanages and schooling and food and things like that. Okay? So providing actual public welfare wasn't on the radar screen for centuries to come. Okay? There is a little spot in Hobbes' Leviathan where he sort of slightly glimpses the possibility that government might get involved in such things, but even through the early liberal thinkers, very, very little discussion of the government getting directly involved in the provision of welfare of any kind. However, a lot of discussion with such things as you've just described, getting out of the way so that you're not taking from people what they need to take care of themselves, and also allowing private charitable activity to thrive. Okay, so that's where they saw the charity coming from the church and from private individuals who had the substance to provide it, and so the emphasis was on the duties and responsibilities of these people. Okay, and also he talks about the duties he truly owes himself, that the king owes himself. He lists first of all the heredity of sons. A happy king is one who has a son to pass on his throne to, and ensuring a happy future, which includes all the stuff we've talked about. Making a good kingdom, a kingdom that actually works, ensures a happy future, not just for the king, but for his heirs. Okay? So that's what he says he truly owes himself, as opposed to just grabbing things and enriching himself temporarily. Okay? So, again, we see this theme coming out of a sort of proto-social contract where the king's interest and the people's interests can be seen as coinciding. They are the same if they're rightly understood. And that's certainly a theme that had legs as we move into modern times. Okay. Probably this will be the last one put up there. So he starts going into a list of things that the king should do or change, I should say, about his policies. And the first one addresses particularly this issue of purveyance. Okay? Here's how it should be done. He says, buying and selling should be done with consent on both sides. Okay? Going to be a major change. I won't be able to just take your iPad. Now we have to bargain. And you can actually say, no, I don't want to sell my iPad. Okay? Or if you do want to sell it, you can set your price. Well, if I'm in a hurry and I really need an iPad, what are you going to charge me? It's worth $500. That's what you paid for it. Yeah, you're going to charge me $600 or more, right? Because part of the value of it is how badly it's needed by me right at the moment. That's the way the market works. So he's introducing this idea that, the peasant gets his price if you really want it. And that's a considerable change because it introduces the market value of things that has to be not just amongst the peasants, but between the peasants and the nobles. So it's a different economic idea, to be sure. And also it takes away the fangs of the nobles, because you can't, no longer are you going to throw people in jail for not wanting to accept your deal. Okay? So an awful lot of people are not going to be punished simply because they want to hang on to what's theirs. Okay? So that's a huge change. He says, where there is no consent, there is not selling, but extortion. Extortion. You know what that is, right? You say, give me this or else. Right? No justice but seizure, no equity but falsehood and iniquity. Therefore, those from whom goods are taken cry to God, referencing the injustice, the sin of it too. What does he mean here by the law of nations, by the way? That's a pretty rare, I think, mention of the law of nations at such an early stage. And he uses it the way later thinkers do. It's a term of art, or it becomes a term of art as it moves into early modern and modern political thought. It refers to basically the practices of people all around the world. Okay, that's really all it is, until we get into international lawyers developing specific international law. But the way most people use this term prior to that was the way William does. It's the practices of most people all around the world to be able to bargain for their goods, right? To be able to demand a certain price and to be free to accept that or not accept it and so forth. So he's basically saying, you're violating the general practice of mankind here. So if we look at what most people do most of the time, we will see that the fairness that we know already to be true, because of God's definition of love and charity and so forth, it's also what we see in the practice of most people. When people are able to bargain, it may seem just like an economic transaction, but it's also a sign of respect between these people, okay? A sign of basic respect, because you're saying, I can't force you to take what I want or to do what I want. I have to get your consent. Okay? I have to bargain with, I have to deal with. Okay? So this is how he ties these together.